Well, we have some die-hard Association fans here sticking around for part 4 of the Association history here on Pop Goes the 60s. We left off with the last video in 1970 when they released their Double Live album, which was an excellent album. It really showcased what they could do on stage, and though the hits were over by this time, at this point, as the 70s began, the 60s ended, there's many other 60s bands that just petered out at the end of the decade. And their hits stopped coming, times were changing, band members wanted to do different things, and in the case of the Association, that held true as well. So they had a member leave the band at this time, Russ Giguere, and he was replaced by Richard Thompson. Richard Thompson had done a little keyboard work on the prior album, and he's not the Richard Thompson, he's not the guitar player from Fairport Convention, he's just a different Richard Thompson, who could sing and write and arrange and play several instruments. So he was added to this album, Stop Your Motor by the Association, 1971. And I must admit, this album, you would think this album was not going to be very good. That they're maybe going through the motions, or they're maybe following old trends. That's not the case with this album. This album sounds like a contemporary 1971 album, production-wise and songwriting-wise. Unfortunately, there are no hits here, but I must say that it almost doesn't sound like the Association of the 60s. Almost. Now, a couple of the songs on here are pretty good, particularly the Jules Alexander song, Funny Kind of Song. They also have a great song called P.F. Sloan, although the single on this album was called Along the Way, which was an original song by Jim Yester. And for the life of me, I cannot figure why they would release this song as a single. It is so ballady, it's so quiet, so mellow. I just don't see how they would have thought this would have been a hit.
I could find the time to understand. I'd hold your hand and I could be.
I just have left some friends and I won't see them again.
Don't sing this song.
Don't sing this song.
Oh wait, I heard every man say, oh yes I heard him say, just the other day.
Nonetheless, they got through this album and they toured. And during this time, they also had some other changes live. They realized that playing live, you had to have certain kind of chops playing on stage. And two guys got singled out here. And that was drummer Ted Bluchel and bass player Brian Cole. Now, neither of those guys played in the studio. He wasn't a good enough drummer, that being Ted, and Brian Cole wasn't a good enough bass player. Just how it was. So they got demoted in a sense, and they were only doing vocals on stage at this point. For the live shows, they brought in a couple other ringers to play. So that didn't really set well with them, but they went along with it anyway. Now, meanwhile, Russ Giguere released a solo album, Hexagram 16, which I would say it's largely forgettable. It's produced by John Boylan, who did the previous studio album. The best song on here is a song that Russ wrote called Now We Begin.
I only hope that we get through to you.
So that song, it's a shame that didn't make it onto the last Association album, but we have it here. So by 1972, the Association, who hadn't had a hit in a while, changed labels. They changed, they're now with Columbia. And they weren't able to consummate a deal with Warner Brothers, having had no hits in a while. So they wound up with Columbia for somewhat of a clone of this album. Same personnel, Richard Thompson is still with them. And for the single on this album, for a band that was trying to write all their own stuff, they did the Loving Spoonful song, Darling Be Home Soon, as their single. And that was not a hit either. So they just could not, for the life of them, find their way back to the pop charts at all. And the song on here that I really like is another Jules Alexander song called Rainbows Bent.
No, I won't waste your time trying.
And now
But generally speaking, this is the album that ended their recording career, because after this they never really recorded again, save for a couple minor instances. After this album, not long after this album in 1972, bass player Brian Cole died of a drug overdose. He was a heroin user, and at this time the band was starting to teeter. You can imagine life on the road for all these years. It's hard on families, it's hard on marriages, you get into substance abuse. That's what happened to the Association. So not long after this album, once Brian Cole left the band, actually, Jerry Yester joined the band for a short while, and but some of the other members started dropping out, and by '73 they were reduced to basically an oldies act, which they've been pretty much to this day. So in conclusion, I would say that the Association left behind a really solid body of work. All of their albums are very consistent. They had obviously some great hits on here, some great album cuts, but generally they don't have any clunker albums at all. And the last two albums that I reviewed, even though they're probably for completists only, they are not an embarrassment. A lot of bands really didn't get into the 70s very gracefully, but the Association did. So those albums are worth listening to. Let's talk a little bit about what's available to buy these days. So I've got a stack of a couple CDs here. The CDs by the Association that were released in the last 15 years or so covered all their albums. The latest batch that I think of highest value is by Now Sounds, and they remastered all their songs from original tapes and included a couple of unreleased songs. So one thing I really wish they would have are more unreleased songs released by this band. There are some things in the vault, I think, but maybe they're just not available or they can't find them. One song I would mention is a song called Autumn Afternoon off of Inside Out. And this is written by the Idrisi brothers. Great song. Another unreleased song on the first album is called Better Times, and this is a Kurt Becher song, and they did not choose to use this song on the album because it was too much sounding like Kurt Becher, and that might be a good example of a song that shows the direction that Becher wanted them to go and that they didn't want to go. And during the recording of this album, they recorded their rendition of The Machine, and that can be found on Just Right Sound.
You see before you this evening a machine of our own construction. You see an Association machine, composed of many integral parts, the first being behind and above us, a semi-reclined percussive invertebrator, or drummer. In the center of the machine, we see a flexible rhythm generator known as rhythm guitar. On the other end of the machine, we see a transistorized flexible rhythm generator stamped Made in Japan. To my immediate right, we see a manifold bifurcated...
This is probably the best compilation that's available on them. It's a double CD set that covers all the hits, a lot of the solid album tracks, a couple of their later singles as well. And some of this stuff is now finding its way out of print. So get these CDs while you can. And they're becoming collectible in and of themselves. But all of these CDs, you just can't go wrong. They have great liner notes in them. And if you can still find them, they have both mono and stereo versions on them. Getting back to the vinyl here, this band's records are really not that expensive to buy. They sold in great quantities, so there's plenty available. And if you do want to collect them on vinyl, original vinyl, it's pretty easy to find and at an affordable price. The only one that's a little bit tough to get, well, they're really not, none of them are really that tough to get. So if you are looking to buy any of this stuff, check out some of the links below. I've got some links where you may be able to find some of these for some decent prices. And when you do that, I get like about 14 cents. So it helps the channel out here a little bit. And glad that you stuck through this long to see all this information on the Association. A band I love and a band I think really deserves the time and care to tell their story. So that's all for today. Catch you next time here on Pop Goes the 60s.